In this presentation, we will take a look at part 2 of our S Corporation comprehensive problem. In this section, we're going to take the client data, the financial statements, and put them into our worksheet. Our worksheet will be located in Excel. Note that if you want to skip this step, or you don't want to put the information into Excel, or you have some other type of system that you typically use, then you can't. We will provide the Excel worksheets at the end of this process that we'll then be using to enter into the tax return. However, highly recommend that you take the data and put it into the Excel worksheet, because no matter what software you use, that's typically something that's going to be a necessary step, so it's worth practicing. Here we are in Excel. We have the client data on the left side. We're focusing here on the financial statements. Now, in practice, we might have the client data on a paper data or some other file where we might have two screens open. We can enter the client data from one screen to the other screen, and we may print it from something like a QuickBooks file or something like that. But in some way, shape, or form, we're having the financial statements, or possibly the trial balance, but here we're going to have the financial statements. Then we're going to have to take that information and enter it into the format that we want to have it in, which is basically back into a trial balance. This is a good practice to do. If you can get the trial balance, you can start with that. However, many book problems have this practice of you're going to have to take the financial statement information and convert it back into basically a trial balance if you're going to enter this information into your Excel worksheet. And it also happens in practice if all you have, if you're getting the paper documentation and you have the financial statements and you want to make adjustments to it, very useful to put in a trial balance. It's also great practice to see the debits and credits converted to the plus and minus format by doing so. Now we're going to have a worksheet that's going to be set up, and we do have the format of just setting up a worksheet like this in a step-by-step process in another course. So if you want to go to that course and just look on how to basically make the worksheet within Excel, you can take a look at that. We have a pre-formatted worksheet here. All we're going to do is take the trial balance and put it into this worksheet. Now this is usually one of the most tedious parts of the system, because you might be thinking, hey, I have the financial statements here, I've got the tax software, why don't I just enter this directly into the tax software? You can. However, it'll be a problem if it's a more complex return, because what you really want to do is be able to do these adjustments. You want to make adjustments to the books, you want to make adjustments to if you need to, and you want to make adjustments to be able to reconcile the book income and the net income and the tax net income and the M1 and the K1 information. It'd be nice to be able to reconcile that. That gives you some verification that everything has been done properly. So I really think it would be best if you're pretty much any size of an S corporation of any significance, you want to put it into a worksheet. Now, the first step of it is usually the most tedious process, because what we have to do is just data input this from one side to the other. We just have to basically enter it in there, but it's not too bad. So let's see what that will look like. First, I'm going to hide some cells because I want to see my data right next to where I'm going to put the data into. So we're going to be working here, starting with column L. We want to end off, I don't even need the prior year or two, I just want the current year data. So I'm going to put my cursor on C, left click on it, and drag all the way over to, let's say, J. Let go, right click that selected area, and hide. So I'm going to hide that, and then I'm just going to pull over this information. And if I didn't have it in Excel, I would have to type it in there. Yes, it would be very difficult, but not too bad, right? And so we're just going to pull over this information and convert it from a plus and minus to a trial balance. And I'm just going to pull over the amounts. Notice what I'm skipping is all the titles. So I don't need the subtitles. That's what we're pulling out to make it easier for us to enter transactions. So I'm just going to say, here's accounts receivable, here's the allowance, here's the inventory. And you could use autofill to do this, but I want to do it one at a time because I want to show that we're going to have to not pull over some things such as the subtotals. So here's the inventory, here's the investments, we have the property, plant and equipment, we have the accumulated depreciation, we have the prepaid assets. Then I'm not going to pull over the subtotal here. I will pull over the numbers, but now the numbers need to be in a debit and credit format. So assets are debits. I'm going to have debits as positive numbers and credits as negative numbers for this worksheet. I'm not going to create two columns for a debit and credit column because it'll be much more simplified if I make credits negative in terms of formulas. If I was, for example, to make debit and credit columns for each of these columns, I would have twice as many columns. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, we would have 10 columns, which would be very long and ugly, and the formulas would be more difficult. So it's really, useful to use this format to have. And so let's see what it'll look like. So we're going to say that's going to be a debit now. It's a debit of that amount, debit. And this is now representing a credit, not a negative number, as it is here. It's a negative number here. It's still a negative number for Excel, but we see it now as a credit. So that now is a credit. We're going to be picking over the inventory. So there's the inventory. We have the bonds. We have the investments. We have the property, plant, and equipment. This is also a credit, contra asset account. These two are contra asset accounts, now a credit, not a negative number. Again, negative number in Excel, but we see it as a credit. And then we're going to skip the subtotal, and I'm going to go back down to the next account, which is accounts payable. We've got the accrued liabilities. We've got the long-term debt. We've got the capital account, and we've got the retained earnings. We'll pull over the numbers now. Now, these are all credits, basically, because they're going to be liability accounts, which have a credit balance, and we have the equity, which are typically credit balance. So I'm going to make these a negative of 70. So now it's a credit represented by a negative number here. So we got credits here, credit. This is a credit of the 16,000. This is a credit of the capital. Now the retained earnings is something that we're going to have to think about, right? Because notice this retained earnings already includes the fact that we closed out the net income to it and may have possible distributions like draws in it. So I can't just use that number because that number already is taking into account all the stuff that got pulled over into it from the income and possibly draws or distributions. Distributions which are like draws for sole proprietorship. So I'm going to just basically say that's going to be yellow for now. And then I'll go down to the income statement. I'll also highlight these. This is like the middle of the trial balance. Under that is the income. So I usually say, hey, that's the equity section. Make it a different color just so I can easily, my eye just goes to the income section when I'm focusing in on it. And then we got the sales, which is basically the revenue account. We've got the allowance account. So there's the allowances. And then I'm going to pull over the numbers. This is going to look funny again because once again, this is a positive number over here, but it's sales revenue, which has a credit balance. So over here, I want a credit. So I'm going to make that a credit. And this is it returns an allowance, which over here decreases the revenue. It's a contra revenue account in essence. But over here, it's going to be a debit because it's kind of like an expense or a contra revenue account, which would bring down net income or be a debit. So I'm going to take the negative of that number. I'm going to flip it to a positive, and that'll be a debit for us. So that conversion is really worth practicing. You want to be able to see in terms of debits and credits and plus and minus to do these kind of adjustments. And then we're going to say that we have the cost of goods sold, and then that's going to give us the gross profit. Cost of goods sold is a debit because it's an expense in essence. So cost of goods sold. Then we have a subtotal. I'm not picking up these subtotals, notice. And then we're going to go down and go to the next actual account, which is going to be the dividend income. So I'll pick up the dividend income. And then the interest income. Those are income accounts and therefore credit balances. So I need to say credit balance. They should be negative of that and negative of that. And then I'm going to skip the subtotal of gross profit, and we're going to go down to the next actual account, which is going to be the compensation. And then we have nothing in the depreciation, so I'll just pick up the depreciation. We have the bad debt. We've got the meals. Now, as you do this, you might be saying, oh, there's going to be something wrong with possibly the dividends and the meals. Maybe that's not fully deductible. Maybe I shouldn't be putting the full amount because I know there's going to be some issue with it. The point is that you're going to put it exactly in the way the client has it. And if you have it, and then if you have any adjustments to it, if you're saying, oh, this is going to need an adjustment, then we make the adjustments. So don't make adjustments as you're entering the client data because you want to be able to tie into the client data first, then fix the client data if you need to make adjusting entries to their data to get the books right, then fix the tax stuff. So you got to do it systematically or else you're going to be all over the place. So we will have an adjustment to meals, but we're not doing it now. And then we're going to go down and we're going to go to the maintenance. And then we're going to go to the business interest. And then we have the property taxes. And then again, charitable contributions. You might see that and just say, well, that doesn't belong here, right? That's going to be an adjustment item possibly. And that's fine. But we're putting it here now. We're tying out exactly to what the client has. And then if we want to make adjustments to the client's books, then we can give them the adjustments that they can enter in their books. So we got to do this in a systematic type of way here. We got the office supplies. We then have the rent. and then the advertising, and then legal services, employee benefits, and telephone, and then finally the miscellaneous. So we have the miscellaneous stuff. Now this stuff down below, I'm going to put in place, and these are going to be some of the tools that we'll be using in order to get those multiple balances we'll see down below. So we won't be working with that until we get to the actual adjustment process, but I'll keep them there in place so you're aware of them. You'll note we're out of balance. Something doesn't work right now. Of course, we haven't entered the numbers here. Let's enter the numbers. I'm going to say compensation. What I'm going to do is say this one, and then I'm going to autofill all the way down because these numbers all should tie out. So once I autofill, it should pick up the next ones all the way down. So I won't tediously go through all the numbers once again by one at a time. I'm just going to put my cursor on that little box, autofill, left click, drag it down. Autofilled, auto drives it down. Dr. Phil does the calculations. There's the autofill. All right, so now we're still out of balance by that 287,408. Why? Well, hopefully it's simply because we haven't entered the retained earnings properly. But you want to be able to reconcile the retained earnings, because I could go up here and say, well, that means that the retained earnings must be a credit of 287,408, right? I could say, well, that should be 287,408. And hopefully that is indeed the case. But you want to basically do a little worksheet and verify that that's the case, because when you enter the data, it should be something that kind of verifies that you have everything in there properly. So if we were to think about that, we'd say, okay, let's do a little worksheet down here and calculate the retained earnings and see if that makes sense. We've got the retained earnings that are calculated here, which are, where's my retained earnings? Down here, the 387,408. Now that's including the net income. So net income's already rolled into that. So net income, if I take net income out of it, then we see the net income was 100,000. So I'm basically going to remove 100,000, which should already be included in there. And that would take us down to 287,408, right? And is that what we have here? 287,408. So that looks good. The other thing you want to do is reconcile it to the prior year as well. So we could do that up top. If I go up top and I unhide these two cells, and I look at the prior year, I'm going to drag from B to L, and then right click and unhide. I hit it. Let's do that. A to M, right click and unhide. Now if we scroll down and look at this prior year retained earnings, here's retained earnings, and we do a little reconciliation. We're going to do a little reconciliation. It's worth doing this at the beginning so that you could make sure your data input is in there properly. So, and if there's a problem with retained earnings, you have to go in and reconcile the retained earnings. So we're going to say retained earnings, let's just say beginning balance, just to do a little reconciliation here, was the 353,408. Then you'd think it would go up by net income in the current year, which we said was 100,000. So that's 100,000 increase. And then you're going to say that it's going to go down by the draws, most likely. So we can put a subtotal here. So we'd say, I would think that would be 453,408, but that's not what the ending balance is. It's 387,408. Something's wrong. Well, maybe there were distributions. Where would you find the distributions in the current year? You'd go to the GL, the general ledger, for retained earnings. If something was directly going to the retained earnings, or possibly they set up another account called distributions, which would be nice because then we'd be able to see them directly. But I'm going to scroll down and say our distributions is in our other data. So we're going to say we have distributions down here. Where do we see here of 66,000? So this is what was paid out like a draw, taken out of the retained earnings. So similar to like a dividend if it was a C Corp, or a draw if it was a sole proprietorship or partnership. And that gives us the 387,408, and that's our ending balance. There's the 387,408. And then you might say, hey, that's not the amount that I see over here that you inputted into the trial balance. You input 287,408, not 387,408. Why? Because this is the beginning balance, and all this other stuff down here is part of equity. And notice if I highlight the entire thing and I set it up this way, the credits minus the debits, and I just highlight this in Excel, I can double check it easily by just selecting this number and highlighting or selecting all the way down, using Excel then calculates the total equity at the end. If I was to close out the temporary balances to retained earnings, would be 387,408. So there's the 387,408, and the beginning number is going to be, as we saw before, the 387,408 minus the net income. And that's going to be 387,408 minus the 100, or the 287,408. That's going to be our beginning number. So in essence, this is going to be the beginning number, but it includes the draws that were taken out. It's not including the net income, because the net income is included down below. All these numbers add up to the net income of the 100,000. Now, this worksheet is nice because it then allows us to see that we're in balance really easily, because the debits equal the credits. I don't have to look at two columns. I can look at one column, and I can easily then calculate different kind of subcategories as we saw before. I can calculate, for example, the net income down here. Net income, easy calculation. I don't have to determine which are the debits and credits and, you know, the sales minus the expenses and whatnot. I just say, hey, the credits are negative numbers and the debits are positive numbers. Therefore, if the credits are winning, as they are here, it's income. Now, if you see that, if you show that to someone else, they're going to say, well, it's a negative number. It shows a loss. And you got to think in terms of debits and credits for it to work. However, way easier to do this than if you had two columns and you tried to fill out a formula down here to figure out the net income of a two-column worksheet. And then you have to put plus and minus, which, you know, the debits minus the credits and this kind of thing. So it's a lot easier if you have this one debits and credits in the one column type of worksheet. Also note that if this didn't work, if you had a problem and you had to go back and figure out where the problem was, you can verify section by section this way really easily. So like the asset section, for example, adds up to 580,408. Well, if you have the debits and credits formatted here, I can say, well, these are assets down to what? That's a liability. So debits minus the credits, debits winning by 580,408. It's really easy to verify. And I don't have to do any math. Excel, you know, I just highlight the cells. I don't need to even calculate anything. So here, if we were going to take a look at the liabilities for the current year, that's going to be this, and this. Adds up to 93,000. If I needed to check that subtotal, there are credits here, but they add up to 93,000. As long as I can recognize that they should be credits, and the credits are represented by negative numbers, then it's easy for us to calculate. And then of course we have the equity section, the retained earnings. Capital retained earnings should be 387,408. That's after everything is closed out to it. And I can verify that number easily because the credits should be winning. So this is going to be retained earnings, and all of the income, credit, sales, debit, expenses should be included. There's the 387,408. You cannot do that if you had the debit and credit columns broken out and you didn't have negative numbers representing credits. It would be a mess. You have to do a lot of math just to verify a simple thing. Just plus and minus math, but a lot of accounts you'd have to go through. And if it was a long S corporation, you really you want to make it just as easy as possible to verify these numbers, because it's not really the complication of the concept. It's really just, there's just a lot of numbers. So you want to be able to verify these things as easily as possible and be able to check each of these numbers as you input it. And if you do that, if you do this format of inputting it, you do have to actually write out, you may have to add new accounts and put in the numbers, but you can verify it really easily. So it'll actually save you a lot of time, especially for longer accounts where you can verify each section. So now that everything's okay, I'm just going to do a quick little formula to basically have our adjustments to be entered. So this is our unadjusted trial balance. This is what came from the client. It mirrors exactly what the client gave us. Then we're going to have our adjustments in this column if needed. These are the book adjustments to get to the adjusted trial balance, which is basically the book trial balance. And to get that, I'm just going to sum up the beginning numbers. I'm going to use the sum function plus any adjustments we have. And the adjustments will be debit and credit format just as we saw before, so I don't need two columns, and this will be a lot easier to use. Now note, again, if we didn't do it this way, you probably have seen textbooks where they have this 3 columns, which are 6 columns, and it's just a big mess. And we're not only going to have that, but we're also going to then take these numbers and then adjust them to a tax basis, and therefore we're going to have to do this kind of adjusting process again. So then I'm going to say the sum of, I want to take the adjusted numbers plus any tax adjustments that we have, and that's going to give us this number. So then again, if you put a debit and credit in all of these columns, you'd have 10 columns, which would just be massively not pleasant to look at. But if you combine them together, then you got, 5 columns here, not too bad. Still a bit overwhelming to look at for a lot of people, but still not a lot better, big improvement. All right, so now we're going to highlight these and we're just going to autofill them down, which is just going to autofill those formulas. I'm going to highlight those 3 cells, put my cursor on this box here, and then I'm going to autofill this down. Autofill this down here, and I'm going to take it all the way down to the bottom. Now, if you're not great at Excel and you don't want to set all this up, we'll provide this in a step-by-step process. It'll be all worked out for you, and you can basically start at this point. But scrolling back down, now we have the 100,000 here. The adjustments that we have will come from this column. 100,000 here. The adjustments we have here will come from this column, and so on and so forth. So this is basically going to be our building blocks. We want to make sure that we're tying out and starting out exactly with what the client has. Then we'll make any adjustments to those numbers.